Hello and welcome to this video tutorial for Prog 1210 Rapid Application Development. This is the second in a video series of the basics of using Entity Framework. In the first video, we added our database to this project and then added the Entity Framework data model. Now we're ready to create our web form. In order to add a new web form to my site, I look in the Solution Explorer, right-click on the project name, and we'll select Add. You can either click on the New Item option, or you can click on the shortcut here for a new web form. We'll give our web form a name. In this case, the web form is going to display information about musicians. So I'm going to call our web form Musician List. The new blank web form appears here. I'm going to start out by looking at it in Design View. Now what we need to create in order to display all of the musicians from the database is a GridView control. The GridView is going to be using a data source that pulls data from our Entity Framework data model. In order to do this, I'm going to create an entity data source. In my toolbox, I'm going to go into the data group and select an entity data source. I drag it and drop it onto the screen, making sure to put it within the boundaries of the form. I'm going to go into the Properties window and give my data source an ID. I'll use the prefix EDS for Entity Data Source, and then Musicians, as this data source is going to show us a list of musicians from the database. Now, I'm going to configure the data source by using the configuration wizard. We start by choosing our connection. Band database entities is the connection that we've created. If you get this error, it's most likely because you haven't built your project yet. So in order to avoid this, I'm going to go up to my project and build my solution. Now we should have no problem running the configuration wizard. You'll notice the name Band Database Entities showing up here as the default container name. Make a note of that name. Here's where we select what type of entity we're going to show in our data source. So we'll open up the drop-down area here. We want our data source to show musicians, and you'll see all of the properties of the musician object showing up here. You can select certain properties to use, or you can select the Select All option. At this point, we're going to stick with Down here at the bottom, I'm going to select these three options for enabling automatic inserts, updates, and deletes. This will help us when we're using our grid view because then we'll be able to enable the insert, update, and delete automatically. I'll click Finish here, and our data source is now configured. The next step is to add the grid view. I'm just going to press Enter before my data source to move it down and make some room for the grid view. Now I'll go into my toolbox, drag the grid view, and drop it onto the screen. Our first step is to choose the data source that powers this grid view. From the drop-down, we'll choose our EDS musicians that we've just created. I'm going to select the options to enable sorting, editing, deleting, and selection. These options will all work automatically, And as we work through our project, we're going to later learn how to customize these links to make them do different things or operate in different ways. But for now, we're going to stick with the automated edit, delete, select, and sort. So at this point, if we run our project, we should be able to see a list of musicians appearing from the database. Sometimes it takes a minute to load up. There we go. A grid view containing all of the musicians from our database. You can see that every field that we selected is here, and all of the links work. So you can see I just deleted person number 1, or we can click on edit and turn this row to edit mode to modify the data for a person here. We'll just test it out to make sure that everything works as we can expect it to. We can test out the sorting as well. So at this point our grid view is operational, but it isn't very pretty. So we're going to do a bit of work on it to make it easier to read, more functional, more user-friendly. Let's go back to our project and work on it a bit. The first thing that I'd like to do is modify the columns. So I'm going to open up our Tasks menu and go into the Edit Columns dialog. Now you'll see down here in the lower left, the area where it says Selected Fields. That's where we would expect to see all the fields that are in our grid view. But aside from the command field, that's the one that shows Edit, Delete, and Select, there's nothing listed here. You'll notice that the Auto Generate Fields is selected. So this automatically generates the fields based on what is in the data source. But this isn't necessarily what we want, because we want to have control over how our fields look and how they operate. So what I'm going to do instead is remove the checkbox from Auto Generate Fields and add in the fields myself manually. Now eventually we're going to want to create template fields for all of our pieces of data. This is because we want to add things like validators and drop-downs and control how things are data bound and displayed. But it's a little bit easier if we create bound fields first and then modify those fields into templates rather than trying to write the templates from scratch. So what I want to do is create bound fields for each of the fields that we want to see in our grid view. Now you'll notice here that there is a bound field option up here in Available Fields, but this is just a generic bound field that isn't bound to anything specific in our entity. So what I'm going to do is click on Refresh Schema in the bottom left of this window, and now you'll see that we have options for different types of bound fields based on the little pieces of data that we have in our data source. So I'm going to add fields for first name, last name, birth date, practice day, and instrument ID, which are the 5 fields that we've been manipulating in class. We can modify the fields by changing the header text, make them a little bit more user-friendly and easier to read. Here's one for first name, last name. We'll change the header for birth date. And while we're doing this, I'm also going to change the format string for birth date. When we looked at it in the browser window, the date showed the time as well. And we don't want that time to show up. So what I'm going to do is scroll down here to the data format string option and put in a formatting string that represents a date only. So the formatting string is 0:D. So that'll show our date in read-only mode as a date without the time. If we want it to show that way in edit mode as well, we need to scroll up a little bit until we see this property called Apply Format in Edit Mode. And we'll just change that to true. So that has formatted our birth date column. I'll just fix up the header text for practice day and for instrument ID. Now when we're finished modifying this, it won't be showing the instrument ID number, but it will be showing the instrument name instead. So I'm just going to set the header text to instrument. So I'll click OK here, run my project again, and you'll see that although it looks like it's working well, when we try to edit or delete, we'll encounter a problem. So I'm going to try to update the first name, but you'll see that we're getting this server error, and the error says no key properties were found. And the problem here is that once we stopped auto-generating the fields, I never did include the ID field in our list of columns. Now when we're doing an action query like update or delete, we need to include the ID so that it knows which record we want to affect. So in order for this to work, without auto-generating the fields, we need to specify for the grid view which field is operating as the key. So I'm going to open up the Properties window. Just need to stop my project. Open up the Properties window and select your grid view. You'll see there's a property here in the data group called Data Key Names. And what we need to do here, I'll just click on this little dialog box launcher. You'll see that we have available data fields, and the data key that we want to use here is musician ID. That's the primary key in our database, and it's also the key in our entity. So I select it here and click the arrow in the center to move it over into selected data fields. I'll click OK. And if we go into the source code, you can see here, I'll just move these down a little bit, that musician ID has been filled into this data key names property of our grid view. So you can do that through the code or through the designer. Now if we try to execute our project, we won't have that same issue because now it knows to pass the musician ID back and forth as the key value. So now our project is functional again. In the next video, we'll work on modifying the instrument field so that it displays the instrument name instead of the ID number, and so that it displays a drop-down in edit mode so that you can easily change which instrument you want and maintain referential integrity between the tables in the database.